Right, so the BBC, for a change, did something good. Something truly brilliant. They actually made the decision to shine a light on the suffering of the people of Gaza from the perspective of the kids there, living through the atrocities being meted out on them by Israel in response to the events of October 7th, 2023. The hostages taken by Hamas and the, to say the least, excessive response by Israel in retaliation for that in a documentary called Gaza, How to Survive a War Zone. God forbid a negative light be shone on Israel in the UK, though, because the Israel lobby has too much power, too much influence, and that pervades the BBC as much as the government with its bought and paid for Zionist figures, not least of which there is Keir Starmer himself, but also all manner of overly vocal and overly platformed pro-Israel organisations and individuals, which when combined with their frankly sickening beliefs, mean they can exert sufficient pressure on the BBC to pull any content they don't like, clearly, even when it is Gazan children talking of their very real and lived experiences. Undermining the BBC's ability to be impartial as this is, when bias is demanded of it instead. The problem for these pathetic and depraved people, though, is that the justification for this move has turned out to be a particularly weak one, and it's been blasted apart, deservedly. And if the BBC don't restore the programme to their streaming service going forwards, the further damage to their reputation this will no doubt cause will be no less deserved. Right, so picture the scene, folks. A documentary that humanises the suffering of children in Gaza. A tale told from the perspective of 4 of them. A rare glimpse into the lives of those living under the constant shadow of the genocide being heaped upon them by Israel, who no more care if they live or die, and more than those actually involved in Hamas. Now imagine that documentary being pulled from a major streaming platform after pressure from not just pro-Israel groups, but in all likelihood from within the BBC as well. Sadly, we don't need to imagine any of this, of course, because it is exactly what the BBC have gone and done. The words of kids of what it is like to live under Israeli atrocity, too scary and too on point for some, out of the mouths of babes and all of that. This is exactly what has happened with the BBC's decision to remove Gaza, How to Survive a War Zone from its iPlayer streaming service. But there has been fallout, of course. Of course there has. Not just for the BBC and their rush to pull it, saying how high when the Israel lobby said jump, but for those making the accusations as well. The basis for their complaints so weak, it hasn't taken much effort to pull apart and expose that those people are so sick in the head, so twisted and messed up, that even Palestinian children scare them witless. So I'm not sure whether to be disgusted or pity these miserable creatures whose own sense of apparent safety appears to hinge completely on the wiping out or silencing of an entire people. The film, which focuses on the lives of children in Gaza, was removed after pressure from pro-Israel groups who falsely claimed it was pro-Hamas. That is the claim. Yet the documentary isn't about Hamas at all, but living in fear as Israel razes your land from one end to the other, north to south, destroys your homes, displaces you, and has you fleeing for your life. Death and destruction all around you as a child. Your world essentially ending, and examining the perspective of that from the eyes of children growing up and living through this. It's about the human cost of war. It's about children. And yet the BBC still caved to the pressure. Doesn't say very much about their commitment to balanced and unbiased reporting, does it? The documentary Gaza, How to Survive a War Zone follows the lives of children living in one of the most densely populated and conflict-ridden places on Earth. It doesn't shy away from the harsh realities whatsoever. It is a truly excellent piece of documentary, clearly too good for its own good, covering life for kids amidst the bombings and the loss and the daily struggle to just survive. But according to the pathetic reprobates that make up groups like the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism, which inflated the Labour anti-Semitism crisis to bring down Jeremy Corbyn, or the Board of Deputies of British Jews, who claim to represent all British Jewry, despite very much not doing so at all. Another pro-Israel organisation as they are, and certainly a great many British Jews are as appalled, if not more so, at the actions of Israel and the BBC here, all done as the Zionist state claims in the name of their religion. The documentary was biased and pro-Hamas, though. Joining them in the outrage of some 45 Jewish British journalists and media figures, not to mention the Israeli ambassador to the UK, Zippy Hotovely, all jumping on the bandwagon to slam the BBC for putting out this documentary, whose expulsion from the UK is now some 15 months overdue in my opinion, and whose ongoing presence here in this country is frankly a source of shame for a great many of us in the UK. Their reason for coming to this conclusion is as weak as it comes so, and perhaps given much of it has come from the apparent research of David Collier of the ratbag group of self-appointed anti-Semitism hunters Nasher Jew, this might not be a huge surprise to some. Groups like the BOD and Labour Against Anti-Semitism and others have a long history of defending Israeli government actions, even when those actions are widely condemned by other human rights organisations. For instance, during the 2021 Gaza conflict, these groups were quick to justify Israeli airstrikes that killed hundreds of civilians, including children, so when they claim the documentary is biased, we have to ask biased against whom? Or more accurately, biased against what narrative? Just the one you spend an unhealthy amount of time pushing and obsessing over yourselves, I fancy. The allegation is that the main child narrator of the documentary is the son of Dr. Ayman al-Yazori, who is the Deputy Agriculture Minister in Gaza, the Gazan government consisting of the political wing of Hamas as that does. But that is enough for al-Yazori to have been identified in the letter of complaint sent to the BBC as a terrorist leader. If Collier and anyone else who had researched this hit job to present to the BBC were half as good as researching as they think they are, though, they'd discover a lot more about al-Yazori. But given the main media are ignoring the additional information that has come to light concerning this minister, I suppose they didn't really have to. Both sides of the story simply don't get reported. Al-Yazori is basically a technocrat with a background in science, not politics, and was appointed by Hamas to this role to help run the Gaza Strip rather than being an actual member of Hamas. This goes for all bureaucrats and civil servants and ministers in Gaza, just the same as it does in the West Bank, where in that case the Palestinian Authority appoint them. But they're not necessarily members of the PA either. If proper research and due diligence were done here, then the BBC would have discovered that al-Yazori was basically a science teacher. He used to be a science teacher in Dubai. He then went to the UK, came here to gain a master's in analytical chemistry at Anglia Ruskin University in Cambridge. So we educated this chap. We educated him a bit further too. He then went on to do his PhD in environmental analytical chemistry at the University of Huddersfield. He's an educated man and a man of science. He went on to write textbooks for education curriculum for the United Arab Emirates. And it was his work in education that then saw him offered the post as Assistant Deputy Minister of Education in Gaza in 2011. He's now Deputy Agricultural Minister in Gaza, where no doubt his environmental PhD comes in dead handy and very much qualifies him for that post. His work there seeing him supporting agricultural activities in areas of crops cultivation, livestock and fishing. I mean, it is just terrifying stuff, isn't it? But here's the thing. The documentary doesn't even focus on him. He's not even part of it. It focuses on his son as one of several children in it, who, like all children in the Gaza Strip, has no say in the political affiliations of their parents anyway, and certainly no control over their own lives, as is the case with Gazans of all ages, because they live under brutal occupation. The critics and those attacking this programme very much on the side of the occupiers and the genocidaires. To claim that this documentary is pro-Hamas, therefore, because of this connection, as ambiguous as that is not only disingenuous, it's a deliberate attempt to silence Palestinian voices, even when it comes to kids. It is yet another in a long line of stories concerning BBC bias and how more and more people are finding themselves unable to trust anything the BBC say. The BBC has long been criticised for its disproportionate platforming of Zionist voices over Palestinian ones, and amongst the critics of this programme are figures such as the former BBC Governor Ruth Deitch, and the former head of BBC Television, Danny Cohen, who naturally ran to a rag like the Daily Fail to proclaim the BBC appears to have given an hour of prime-time coverage to the son of a senior member of the Hamas terrorist group. Either they were not aware of the terrorist links because they did not carry out the most basic journalistic checks, or the BBC did know and misled audiences about the family's deep involvement with terrorism. Deep involvement with terrorism, because being responsible for crop rotation and fishing rods is very terroristic, isn't it, Danny, you utter balloon? A 2024 report by Jacobin magazine highlighted that the BBC consistently frames the Israeli-Palestinian conflict through an Israeli lens, often presenting Israeli government claims as fact while scrutinising Palestinian narratives. So the opposite of what Danny Cohen said there is very much true. As another example, BBC presenter, BBC News, mainstream news anchor, Samantha Simmons, has been called out for repeating Israeli claims without question, while Palestinian perspectives ended up being sidelined or dismissed. She, incidentally, used to be a member of a Zionist youth movement, so due diligence, well done again on that, and the impartiality once more, BBC. But the BBC's decision to pull this documentary is another in a long line of abject failures. failure to stand up to pressure, failure to uphold journalistic integrity, a failure to give a platform to voices that are too often silenced. By caving to these demands, the BBC is sending a clear message that Palestinian suffering is less important, less newsworthy, and less deserving of empathy than Israeli suffering, even though Israel are imposing the suffering on these people. But people are pushing back. Social media is flooded with calls for the BBC to reinstate the documentary. Activists, journalists, ones with integrity, and everyday viewers are demanding accountability here. And of course, we can all join in on this point as well. Share this video for one, not to blow my trumpet, but it's a start. Keep talking about this issue, very much so. Write to the BBC. Let them know that silencing Palestinian voices isn't on, especially when even the voices of children seem to not be acceptable to them. The BBC's decision to pull Gaza, How to Survive a War Zone, I'll keep reiterating that title, is more than just a bad editorial choice. It's a symptom of a larger problem within the BBC and in wider mainstream media. It's about who gets to tell their story and who doesn't, who gets silenced instead. It's about whose suffering matters and whose doesn't, ultimately. And it's about holding powerful institutions accountable when they fail to do the right thing. This is just the latest in a long line of Israel bias scandals the BBC has found itself embroiled in. Each and every time it does more damage to them than the last. Impartiality gone out of the window, and here's yet another example of them not learning for that. Of another example that's happened in recent months you might not have heard about, as your recommended next watch. Please do hit like, share and subscribe if you haven't already, though, before you go, to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content and help support the channel at the same time too, which is massively appreciated. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.